Hello crafty friend, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be sharing a fun technique using Distress Embossing Glaze that will add loads of texture and shine to your card. And for this technique, I'm going to be stamping in the embossing glaze. If you aren't familiar with embossing glaze, it's similar to embossing powder in that it needs something to stick to, and then you must heat set it using a heat tool. It's different from embossing powder though in that it's transparent, which means you can see through it. This property gives you the opportunity to layer this medium and create some really amazing effects. In the description box below, I will have links to all of the supplies I used to create this card. When you shop through those links, it supports me and I appreciate that so very much. Now let's get on with the making. I started by cutting a piece of heavyweight white cardstock to 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inches. I then attached a piece of thin chipboard to the back side of the cardstock using an adhesive sheet cut to the same size. The chipboard keeps the paper from warping. During the process of playing around with this technique, I found that the thicker the chipboard, the less warping I had. But as long as I used a piece that was at least the thickness of a cereal box, I was okay. I also recommend staying with at least this size of paper and no larger, so that you have the best success when using this technique. I'll explain more as I get into it. Now I'm going to begin the embossing, and I'll be applying multiple layers of ink and embossing glaze. The minimum number of layers I recommend for this technique to work effectively is 5, but you can always add more. I'll be working with VersaFine watermark ink, and I'm going to apply the ink directly to the paper, making sure to cover the entire surface with ink. Next, I'm going to pour the embossing glaze over the surface of the paper. The color I'm working with here is Seedless Preserves. I'm working over a piece of typing paper folded in half, which makes cleanup faster and makes it easier to return the excess powder back to the jar. For now, I'm just going to set this paper with the excess powder to the side, but out of the way while I use my heat tool, because I'm going to be adding multiple layers of embossing glaze. Here I'm using my heat tool to melt the embossing glaze powder. As you can see, as the powder heats up, it begins to melt and become shiny. I'm going to allow the paper to cool before I continue. It doesn't have to be completely cool, but you don't want it to still be hot to touch either. Once it's cooled down, I'm going to repeat this entire process of inking the cardstock, adding a layer of embossing glaze, tapping off the excess, and heat setting it. I'll be doing this 3 more times for a total of 4 layers. As I add each layer, it becomes more and more jelly-like. Make sure to give the melted embossing glaze powder time to cool off before you add the next layer of ink. For the 5th and final layer, I'm going to add a little something extra, super fine gold embossing powder. I'm going to start off by inking the paper as before, but when I go to add the gold embossing powder, I'm going to pinch out the tiniest amount of powder and even tap off some of that before I sprinkle it randomly onto the ink. Because embossing powder is opaque, even if you can barely see what you've sprinkled on, it will really show up once you start to apply the heat with your heat tool. Next, I tap off the excess gold powder and then sprinkle more of the Seedless Preserve embossing glaze over the ink. If you're worried about getting gold embossing powder mixed in with your glaze, you can always just throw out that excess powder. As I start to heat this layer, you can see what I mean. The gold you could barely see really begins to pop as the powder melts. And here's how it looks when the powder is completely melted. I really love the shine and sparkle the gold embossing powder added. Now I'm going to do the stamping part. For this you will need to use rubber stamps. I would not recommend clear stamps as they may get damaged from the amount of heat this step requires. I also recommend using a stamping platform because you will need to do the stamping very quickly. Just make sure to remove all of the stamp inserts and magnets as you won't be needing them during this step and you don't want to accidentally melt the foam pad. I'm going to be using one of the images from the Tim Holtz Floral Trim stamp set. A couple of other options that I think would work nicely are the Baroque and Floral Outline stamp sets. To help hold my embossing glaze piece in place in my stamping tool, I'm going to apply a tiny bit of repositionable adhesive to the back side of the piece. As you will see, it can be handy to be able to re-stamp the image if needed. Once I get everything in position, I'm going to use my heat tool to remelt the embossing glaze. You can tell when it's melted because the glaze starts moving around from the heat. During this process, I'm moving my heat tool around a lot to make sure the entire piece is remelted. I then quickly press my stamp into the melted embossing glaze, making sure to push down really hard over the entire area. The idea here is that you are pushing the stamp into the melted embossing glaze to create an impression. This part does take a bit of muscle and must be done rather quickly because the glaze starts to cool as soon as the heat source is removed. During this step is where working with a smaller piece is easier. The larger the piece you try for this technique, the harder it is to get a good impression because the glaze starts to cool so quickly. Here I'm giving it a few seconds to cool and then opening the stamping platform to reveal the impression that was created. As you can see, the impression isn't as good in a couple of areas, but that can be easily fixed. Because the paper didn't move, all I have to do is reheat those areas, making sure the glaze is remelted, and then re-stamp the image. Now, if your paper does happen to move, it's not the end of the world. You can also reheat the entire piece and repeat the entire process to get your impression. Because I didn't get a good impression in a couple of sections, I'm going to reheat each one and re-stamp them to get a better impression in those areas. Here you can see the impression that was created by stamping in the embossing glaze. I absolutely love the texture and interest this creates. Now I'm going to add another layer of fun by adding some Sizzix Gold Luster Wax. I'm applying a tiny amount of the wax, using the tip of my finger to gently rub the wax over the open areas of the floral design. You can refer to the stamp if you're having trouble seeing what areas to apply it to. I keep applying the wax until the entire design is filled in. And as you can see, the wax really makes the impression pop even more. With this part completed, let me show you how I finished the card. I took a piece of Distress watercolor paper cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches and applied Seedless Preserves Distress Spray Stain to it. Here I'm working in a splat box to contain the mess. I then spritz the paper with some water and use my heat tool to dry the ink. I like to use a paper towel to dab up any extra ink or large droplets, especially if the ink starts to pool along the side of the paper. Once the paper is dry, I'm going to ink the edges with some Seedless Preserves Distress ink just to fill in the white spaces. As you can see, it doesn't cover up the inked areas, but it does add some depth to things. Next, I'm going to ink the edges with a bit of Walnut Stain Distress ink, and then follow that with a bit of Black Soot Distress ink. If you're worried about getting too much black soot on the edges, you can always hold the paper and rub the blending tool along the edge. With the background completed, I'm going to move on to the next layer, which is a piece of black cardstock cut to 3 1/2 by 4 3/4 inches. Here I'm sanding the edges of it using a sanding disc, but you could also use a piece of sandpaper. Just make sure to work on a piece of scrap paper or chipboard so that you don't damage your work surface or craft mat. Here I'm applying scrapbook.com clear double-sided adhesive to the back side of the glazed piece. This tape is one of my favorites because you can easily tear or cut it to the length you need. I often use the edge of an ink pad to pull against as I tear the tape, instead of having to pull out some scissors. I then continue adhering the layers together. To finish off the card, I used one of the leaf dies from the scrapbook.com Layered Roses die set and cut that from vellum. I cut it out twice and used artiste glue to adhere them together. I then trimmed off any of the stem that might show behind the sentiment. I then glued the leaves to the card using the same Artiste glue. I chose to use vellum and a more detailed die so that I didn't cover up too much of the embossing glaze piece. Next, I attached the sentiment using double-sided foam adhesive for a little dimension. For the final touch, I added a couple of butterflies from the scrapbook.com Butterflies 2 die set that I cut from black cardstock and sanded before I adhered them with double-sided foam adhesive. Here's a look at the completed card. Take a look at that embossing glaze piece with the gold embossing powder and the stamped impression highlighted by the luster wax. This is such a fun way to use embossing glazes and to add an element of texture and shine to your cards. I used the same technique to create 2 more cards using 2 different colors of embossing powder. One with Mermaid Lagoon and the other with Mowed Lawn. You can see them all in more detail on my blog. I'll have a link to it in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed learning all about this fun technique and take the time to give it a try. Until next time. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.